So this is obviously a very special edition of the Week in Review. We are here across the Colorado River on the Mexican side of the Colorado River near Los Alagones, Mexico. We are looking at the United States border wall. It's imposing. Certainly get a feeling of how big it is. It's giant compared to the guy you can see down there, but is this barrier really doing its job? That's what we've been trying to answer over the last 48 hours as we've been down here in Yuma, Arizona, looking over every facet of the American immigration policy. We've been talking to Border Patrol agents. We've been talking to humanitarian volunteers, medical professionals who assist migrants coming across. We've been talking to agricultural leaders who rely on migrant workers to basically grow, farm, and produce the produce that we eat in America. In fact, 90% of the leafy green vegetables consumed in America grown here in Yuma during the winter months between October and March each year. Just a huge part of our food chain. And in fact, one of the agents we spoke with talked about how our food security is a national security issue. But national security, folks, if you look at this edifice behind me, as I said a moment ago, looks imposing. But we have uncovered serious deficiencies in America's border security on this trip. We're going to talk about those as we begin a very special edition of the Week in Review from Mexico. So there are some things you have to see to believe. And even when you see them, you can't believe it. And the border between the United States and Mexico is one of those things. Because having seen it now, you just can't believe what's happening there. You can't believe what's happening to this country as a result of what's happening there. But there's a lot more to this debate than what you see on the network news and what you hear from the political punditry, many of whom have not even visited the border to see it for themselves. This is an incredibly layered issue, and it's one that needs to move past that cable news debate and into a real debate about how do we create a policy in America that doesn't create humanitarian crises at the border, which creates pathways for legal status, for necessary workers for our economy, but that prohibits criminal elements, cartel gangs, from shipping drugs and trafficking humans into this country. One of the guys we spoke with that you're going to hear from in this episode spoke of a country with tall fences and wide gates that address the need for security of, again, that criminal element, that violent element, that drug element, but that also provided that wide gate through which, again, the workers that this country needs. In fact, if you look at Yuma County, Arizona, where Dylan Nolan and I have been for the last week, that area produces, during the winter months, 90% of the leafy green vegetables consumed in all of North America. So those workers literally feed this country. Literally feed this country. So, again, it's a multifaceted issue, but I wanted to just briefly go over where we were before I got into what we saw and before you hear from some of the folks that we spoke with. For the last few days, we've been in the Yuma Sector of the U.S.-Mexican border. The U.S.-Mexican border runs for about 2,000 miles from San Diego to the mouth of the Rio Grande in the Gulf of Mexico. There are 9 different sectors. The one we were in was a 126-mile sector called the Yuma Sector, which basically runs from the Imperial Dunes in California midway through Arizona. It's 126 miles of border, but it's about 180,000 plus square miles. So it's a huge area, and there's a tremendously diverse tremendously diverse mixture of terrains there. There's desert, there's mountains, there's farmland, there's urban areas. And all of those different mixtures actually fall along the border, river boundaries, urban street boundaries. And yes, we're going to talk about the wall. But as we toured this incredibly explosive area where, again, it's the front line of this crisis, some of the things we saw were just absolutely stunning. And I wanted to start out probably the thing that shocked me the most on this trip. And there are a lot of things that shocked me. And we're going to be talking for days, for weeks, for months about everything that we learned on this trip. And not only what we learned, but how it impacts our communities here in South Carolina and other communities across the country. But one of the things that I saw that shook me, literally shook me, and pissed me off, kind of got my blood boiling, was on a little strip of road near the California, Arizona, Mexican border. It's a little triangle where all these areas come together, and there's a dam there called the Morales Dam. And this is one of the areas where in 2019, under former President Donald Trump, they actually, quote, built a wall. Now, if you've read FITSNews, you know that we've been critical of Trump for not following through on the wall. He promised to build it, promised Mexico would pay it, only ended up building about 453 miles of the 1,000 miles that were promised, and of those, a very small percentage of those 453 miles were actually places where there had been no wall before. But this was one of the places. We went there. We went to one of the brand new walls in Yuma County, Arizona. But here's what just blew my mind. As we approached the wall from the south, we saw this huge depot-looking facility with piles of steel beams, of wiring, of pipe, of other wall-building materials. And again, the wall's not just a structure. There are cameras here. There's technological monitoring. There's sensors. There's all sorts. It's all interconnected. It's not just a physical structure. But we passed this depot where all of those materials were literally sitting on the ground and have been sitting there for the past 2+ years. And just half a mile down from that depot, there's a gaping 30+ yard hole in this wall. And the reason there's a hole in that wall is because on January 21st of 2021, new U.S. President Joe Biden signed an executive order halting all construction on the wall. They just stopped with a 30-yard gap. And if you're watching this on our YouTube, you're looking at it right now. We got several pictures, several videos of it. It's unbelievable. A 30-yard gap while the pile of materials to fill it are sitting just half a mile down the road. But they stop. And wouldn't you guess that 30-yard hole is an absolute flashpoint of illegal alien crossings? Kids, as young as 1 year old, literally plopped on that barrier. Drugs, people smuggled through. And by the way, the human trafficking is even more profitable to the cartels than the drug smuggling. In the Yuma sector alone, they make $2.4 billion a year smuggling people across that border. $2.4 billion a year just on the human trafficking. So the guy that I mentioned it earlier, tall fences and wide gates. The guy who said that is the former chief of the Yuma sector. His name is Chris Clem. He spent 27 and a half years of his life on border security in Texas as a deputy chief of the El Paso sector, and then for the last few years as the chief of the Yuma sector. We sat down on the border with Chief Clem to get his thoughts on this crisis and what can be done about it. Here's that interview. All right, folks, we're back from the border. Spent some time at the wall today, but I wanted to talk with a guy who spent 27 and a half years in the fight to protect our borders, keep our borders secure. Chris Clem, you're the former chief of the Yuma sector here in Yuma, Arizona, Yuma County, also deputy chief at the El Paso sector. Yep. So you've seen all parts of the border. There was something you said earlier. You said our nation needed to be a country of wide gates and tall fences. What did you mean by that?
Well, thank you for asking the questions. And yes, I spent the last 2 years before I retired as the chief here in Yuma, and prior to that was a deputy in El Paso. So I've seen a lot of the border crisis. But tall fences and wide gates, look, tall fences indicate security. We have a right and an obligation to be able to secure our homeland. But we also have a humanitarian aspect, and we also have an immigration solution to a lot of our economic issues facing this country, and that's what the wide gate should be. Wide gates should be our ports of entry where we can control and manage and do the right things with lawful trade and travel tourism and people coming to the United States. And so, to me, that's the best way to describe it. Let's secure our border, and that's the tall fences. And then let's work on trade and travel, the humanitarian way of doing things with proper wide gates, and that's the ports of entry.
You talked about 80-20, and for the folks that are watching this, Border Patrol, your goal is to have 80% of your agents at any given time actually patrolling, actually working on securing the border, and 20 doing the paperwork that's associated with it. That's not the ratio as it stands now, though, is it?
No, well, that was always a goal. I mean, if things could be the best way would have at least 80% of my workforce at any given time patrolling the border where it needed to be. And then the 20% was going to be, hey, when we catch people, we do have a process. We do have some administrative duties we have to handle. And so that was really a good split for us. That was really keeping, our border under control and limiting and mitigating the vulnerabilities. When this irregular mass migration, all these illegal entries started hitting here, we went where it was almost a complete opposite, where 80% of my workforce wasn't patrolling border. They were processing and caring for the migrants, which left 20% trying to cover 126 miles of border. But by the end of any 8-hour shift, that 20% was sometimes down to 10% or sometimes down to nothing, just because of the sheer volume. And so that's where these policies and some of the things that need to be corrected would come in place, so we can mitigate the vulnerabilities that irregular mass illegal immigration causes.
Let's talk real quick about those policies. Walk us through. Obviously, there's some executive actions that can be taken. Where do you look as far as legislative versus executive solutions? What are a few things that Congress needs to do versus what a president could do?
Well, the laws have been on the books for quite a while. It is 8 USC 1325 is illegal entry. Okay, so the laws are there. What Congress can do is they handle the purse strings with appropriations, and so they can codify some of these executive policies, like we've seen with the asylum country agreements, to make sure people claim asylum in the first country they're able to. The Migrant Protection Protocol, which is also known as Remain in Mexico, there's ways that could be smoothed out a little bit better. Congress can codify that, but they can also fund ICE, which is Immigration Customs Enforcement, which is responsible for that second cog in the wheel when it comes down to illegal immigration. Border Patrol's job is to apprehend anybody and anything that comes in illegally between the ports of entry. We apprehend, we process, and we're supposed to turn somebody over to ICE if it's an immigration case. But when there's no room at the end, because Congress is not funding them, there's no space to put somebody, we have to release them to the communities so they can get their hearing. So that's where Congress can maybe make some adjustments through appropriations, holding the executive branch accountable, and maybe tweak some of the existing laws in regards to detention.
Now, you've spoken about the previous administration, former President Trump, about those policies being effective at shutting down that flow of mass migration at the southern border. I wanted to ask you something. As we toured the wall earlier today, there was a huge depot, steel beams, wires, all sorts of wall building equipment. What happened to those policies of the past administration? Has all that stuff been sitting there for the last 2 years?
Yeah. So the wall system, and I want to make sure that all your folks understand that it wasn't just brick and mortar and steel, right? There was a package with that. It was infrastructure in the form of wall, but it was also roads and access to the border. It was technology in the form of sensors and cameras, and it also involved some more border patrol agents. So when President Trump had introduced that package where we were going to build the wall, it was the wall system, which was the system piece was the most advantageous to us, because wall just slows people down, right? But that gives us the tactical advantage. Well, when President Biden took office and he made several executive actions or executive orders, one of those was shutting down the construction of the existing plans. So what was bought and paid for by the American people sat there and and essentially just rotted, if you will. Well, steel didn't really rot, but it was sitting there. And you talk about a gut punch to our agents when they're driving and see this wall that's helping them do their job, and then there's a huge gap. Knowing that just stacked and stacked and stacked was the steel, and you saw that there's still some there. We needed to get that fixed. We have a few gaps that have been closed for life and safety reasons, but they're not finished yet. And yet that steel is still sitting there. That's been bought and paid for twice already.
Let me ask you one last question. You've talked about the need for consequences for those who come across illegally. But you've also talked about not everyone comes across as a bad person, not everyone who comes across is a criminal. But let's set aside for a moment the intentions of people who are coming in. At this point right now, does the United States of America have an intact southern border?
It just depends on where and where and when we're talking about it. There are times where I can tell you unequivocally, when I was in charge during the Biden administration, there was points where I could tell you nothing was getting through that we didn't know about it. But then there was a lot of parts that was left wide open. The cartel controls the flow of people coming into certain locations. That's a deflection and a detraction from our operations. And so there are plenty of areas that are wide open that we're not able to get to. It's gotten a little bit better just because some of the numbers have gone down. But the reality is policies, enforcement actions and consequences for those that are coming in here illegally, knowingly coming in here illegally, there has to be a consequence. Nowhere else in this country can you cut in front of the line? Can you bully your way into someplace? Can you demand things? Yet we allow this to happen on a regular basis at our southern border. That goes back to the tall fences and the wide gates, right? Now look at everybody's homes. Got a lock on the front door, a lock on the bedroom, a lock on the bathroom, but we're having a hard time putting lock in some spots of our southern border. It's kind of ridiculous.
Chief Clem, you've certainly done your part. We appreciate you taking the time to talk with us about these issues, and thank you again for everything you've done.
You got it. Thank you.
Yes, sir. So obviously, Agent Clem, a former Border Patrol leader, but we also got to hear from those currently tasked with securing the Yuma Sector border, where, again, just a huge amount of drug, human trafficking coming across that border. But Agent Job Figueroa, one of the leaders of the Yuma Sector currently, gave that briefing, and some of the things he said, folks, I couldn't believe I was actually listening to a current employee of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, whose leader has claimed that the border is secure, who works for a U.S. president, whose policies have created this mass migration and humanitarian crisis. But some of the quotes that Agent Figueroa provided during the briefing just blew me away. Here's just a few of them. He said, and I quote, "The entire world is at our front door, and it hasn't stopped in 2 years." He talked again about the network news outlets talking about the migrant caravans. He said, we see a caravan every single day. Every single day. Another quote that just blew my mind. Echoing the statements from the soon-to-be former border chief, Raul Ortiz, he said, we had operational control of the border in the past. Now, we asked him to specify exactly when. He was a little coy in that, but the implication was very clear there, that there had been operational control, that there was no longer operational control. But here's the quote that really blew my mind, because it goes to the very heart of this issue that we're addressing. Agent Figueroa said, and I quote, if there's no consequence in terms of enforcement, they keep coming. If there's no consequence in terms of enforcement, they keep coming. So Chief Clem and Agent Figueroa weren't the only border security leaders that we spoke with. We also talked to local law enforcement, specifically Yuma County Sheriff Leon Wilmot, who addressed the drug crisis and the sheer staggering amounts of fentanyl coming across the border. Here's an excerpt from his remarks.
So fentanyl obviously is the big one now. So Texas, the first quarter of 2023, Texas seized about 1.5 million dosages of fentanyl and 33 kilograms. For New Mexico, 923,000 dosages or pills and only 9 kilograms. Now, keep in mind, 1 kilogram is 2.2 pounds. So if you want to do the math on that, that's still quite a bit. California, they had 10.9 million seizures of pills and 627 kilograms of fentanyl. Arizona, 24.27 million pills this first quarter. 877 kilograms. So for the whole of the southwest border this first quarter, There was over 43.6 million dosages or pills of fentanyl and 1,561 kilograms of just fentanyl. And we know throughout this country, over 100,000 people are dying each and every year now because of fentanyl. The scary part is that most law enforcement throughout the United States has had to adapt in regards to fentanyl by carrying Narcan so we can revive people and save their lives. So now your cartels are further exploiting this by adding, and I always crush this word, but xanafil. It's basically a drug that's used for equines, horses. And the problem is, once they lace fentanyl with this narcotic that's used on horses, Narcan no longer works. So we're not going to be able to save lives anymore. And we've actually had to put out a press release, local law enforcement, the city of Yuma, as well as the county, to anybody that knows a family, a friend, anybody that doesn't fentanyl, that they might not be able to save that loved one's life now because of what's being laced into fentanyl.
On the day we got back from Yuma Sector, 18 attorneys general across this country filed a lawsuit in federal court in North Dakota challenging the latest border rules put in place by the administration of Joe Biden. That lawsuit claims that these new rules will in effect turn illegal crossings into a legal pathway to status, which again goes against the tall fences, wide gates approach that Agent Clem spoke about. Now, I do want to talk for a minute about those who do this right, because a lot of what you've heard so far on this show deals with what's going wrong. The bad hombres, if you will, former U.S. President Trump called. Which, by the way, I do want to point out, there's all this talk about Mexicans coming across the border. It's very interesting to learn that at least in the Yuma sector, Mexican nationals rank 8th or 9th on the list of nationalities crossing. So they're actually a much smaller percentage than you would imagine. A lot of these folks, Central America, but as we found out on this trip, Russians, Chinese nationals, multiple individuals on the terrorist watch list. Again, this is why we have to have this twin approach. The tall fences cracking down on the criminal element coming in, but the wide gate. So let's talk about that for a minute, because two of the folks that were on this trip actually came to this country through that wide gate. They came to this country the right way. And one of them is a state representative from New Hampshire, Jose Cambrils. We spoke with him. I wanted to just cut real quick to an excerpt from that conversation. Here's that.
Well, for me, it's almost a personal issue, because my family escaped from communist Cuba in 1965. So I came to this country when I was 5 years old, and I saw, what my parents had to give up and the hardships in order to get into this country, and they did it the legal way. So I have a perspective of, I like to see things done. I like the rule of law, and I like things to be fair. So I kind of came down on this trip with a kind of a perspective of, illegal immigration is something that I'm against, and I don't like. But after having been down here, I see that it's really it's a multifaceted problem, and that there's no one solution, no one size fits all. So this trip was very educational for me, and it gave me a bit of a different perspective on how I think about what they're calling the border crisis.
What was your, as far as perceptions coming in, what was the biggest, I guess, misperception, the thing that surprised you the most about what's actually happening here versus what you thought when you came down?
Well, what absolutely shocked me was I expected to come to this town, Yuma, and see it just overrun with illegals in every corner, a lot of homeless. And actually in our city, in our capital, Concord, you see more homeless people on the corners of Concord, New Hampshire than what I saw here. So one of the things that I'm going to bring back to my people is that they have the perception, like I did, that these towns down here are just overrun, and that's not the case at all. And I do want to let them know that people are being processed through these towns, and then they're being sent elsewhere throughout the United States. So that was probably the biggest misconception that I had, and now I'm glad that I see the reality of what's really happening.
What's it like when you look at, you talked about everything that your family went through to get here and doing it the right way. When you see the way that the current administration handles this process, literally zero consequences for those who violate the law by coming in, because it is illegal. There's a reason they're called illegal immigrants. How does that make you feel when you see that policy shift?
It's disgusting, and again, and I don't blame the immigrants. They have every right to want to have a good life, and because this administration is facilitating it, why not, right? Go for it. But the policy is absolutely disgusting. You have to have borders. If not, we're not going to have this. The reason people are coming to this country is because it's really the golden goose, of the world. And if you have no borders, and it's not just Mexican people coming across. That was another thing that my eyes were open to, is that the vast majority that are coming across are coming from other countries, and some are not very friendly countries. So, we could be seeing the fabric of our country is going to be torn apart, and I think it's very dangerous for our nation. So,
Killing the proverbial golden goose,
yes,
as it were.
yes.
Representative, thank you. Appreciate your time and your perspective on this. It's one that certainly I think our folks back home are going to really want to hear, because, as you said, there's a right way and there's a wrong way, and we've got to figure out a way to reward those who do it right and hold those accountable who do it wrong.
Yeah. And again, I just want to stress that, and people need to know that it's not one size fits all. We're going to need multiple solutions, because one area of the border, it's all about migrant workers, and that's the situation, and we need migrant workers. Another section of the border may be just a drug funnel, and that needs a different type of a solution. So, and you don't treat all the people the same. Some people are good people. Some of the people are really nasty players, and I think we need to have policies to deal with all the different facets of what's happening at the border.
So another example of someone doing it the right way is South Carolina's own Jer Little. Jer spent nearly the first 3 decades of her life in communist China. She came over to the United States on a green card, but in the last year has actually become a United States citizen. And not only that, serving back, giving back. She's a member of the South Carolina State Guard. We sat down with Jer not only to get her thoughts on what she saw on this trip, but also her experience, again, doing this the right way.
This trip gave me a lot more, a wholesome picture of what are all the links, what are all how the whole ecosystem works for this situation to continue. I think I speak for myself, I guess. I am not as frustrated or upset as I thought I would be, because I do realize it's such a big issue and deep-rooted. I'm glad that I get to see and hear from the Border Patrol, the community, including the school, the health center, the nonprofit side, the agriculture, the people living here who's kind of getting all the impact, law enforcement, all these parties. Now I have a better picture. I want to process it and trying to figure out what is a constructive way one person can do with my experience and knowledge.
Let me ask you this question. Looking at your perception of the border prior to witnessing it,
Yes.
versus now that you've heard from all those stakeholders and seen it with your own eyes,
Yes.
what's the one thing that has surprised you the most? The one perception you had that turned out not to be accurate, or something that you found that surprised you?
Yeah, I've been reflecting on that. It's actually I'm trying to really processing what I've seen. I think one thing is surprising is the reality and the gravity of the danger, the national security side, and also the desperation of people. Because until you really stand on the border and look on the other side and think about what we have on this side, I realize it's life and death. It's different when you see on TV, but you stand there and we watch that video of the 1-year-old kid being dropped and then just left there. I think that's pretty impactful. But I'm also kind of really surprised on how much resources we spend on this. Like when you hear the number, it's in the billions. And this is not sustainable. We know that. But now seeing the real people, hearing from the Border Patrol officer, talking about it like a really tactical, very bad situation, that's shocking.
Were you surprised to hear how open some of the current and former Border Patrol agents were about the deterioration of the situation over the last 2 years since the administration shift from Trump to Biden?
That's a long sigh, right? I think it's giving me more factual information, which is helpful, because I think it's really easy for people to just make assumption like, well, from whatever administration to another one, there's always people who are going to be criticizing or praising them. But what I heard, what I saw was factual numbers, pictures, images, and the way they explain this from the sheriff, but also the Border Patrol officers, I think I admire them for doing that. Yes, it's kind of astonishing to hear all this. Not surprised, but I also don't think it's a problem of just posing the executive branch. It's an issue I think it's a lot more well spread, because I think whether the agencies have a lot of responsibility, and from your highest ranking to your rank and file, everybody, if they don't get the right information, they're going to keep doing something that might not be helpful.
Sure, wonderful. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Awesome. All right, so those are some folks who are doing it right. As I mentioned earlier in talking about the agricultural industry in Yuma and how it is essential to feeding the Northern Hemisphere, doing it right is incredibly important, because that industry, that ag industry down there, it requires between 25,000 and 40,000 migrant workers every day during the peak season. And not just in Yuma, but over in California during their peak season as well. In fact, more workers required there. Many of the Yuma workers actually go to California during those peak seasons. They're absolutely vital to America's food supply. And we asked the leaders down there, well, why don't you hire Americans for those jobs? And they responded, you try. In fact, one of the lines we heard often while we were there is, and I quote, "The gringos don't want to work." The gringos don't want to work. Well, and I wonder about that, because while we incentivize the illegal entry into our country from the southern border here in America, what have we been incentivizing for years, right? Not working. So we wonder why this happens. Of course the gringos don't want to work. They're absolutely right. Again, it's not a simple issue, people, and we have received so much information during our border visit from so many different constituencies: law enforcement, educators, business leaders, just a ton of information. Processing it and trying to bring it to you to present not only what's really happening, what you're not seeing on the televisions, on the cable news, from the mainstream press, who again just trying to pull people apart. There's been so much misinformation about this story for years, because those media outlets, they're not here to educate you about what's happening. They are here to stoke your anger, whether you're a progressive who thinks that we're, putting kids in chain link fences and just letting them die, or whether you're a hardline conservative that borderline xenophobe. You're being pulled apart on this issue. That's why we are approaching it differently. I've never breathed fire on the issue of immigration, people, unlike a lot of folks who are in the South Carolina conservative establishment, whatever these labels. I've always believed that we've got to have, at the very least, a pathway to status for folks who come in this country who want to work, who want to do it right, like Carlos and like Jer. But again, for every Carlos and Jer, there's a drug leader coming in with 2 humans they trafficked, with a big backpack full of fentanyl, guns. And they come to our communities very quickly. In fact, Sheriff Wilmot told us, it's only our problem for a few minutes. Within 72 hours, it's your problem. And I want to pull this up real quick as we cut out of this segment, because this is a graph. This was the one thing we were allowed to take a picture of in our Border Patrol briefing. The one I mentioned earlier, where we heard from active agents talking about just how bad this situation has gotten over the last 2 years. Again, a caravan every day, they told us. Every day. But I wanted to pull this graph up because this really just brings it home. Now, this is just the Yuma Sector, people. This is just the Yuma Sector, but you can see these are where the gotaways are going. These are where the border traffic, it's where it goes. Everywhere. And you zoom in there, and you see South Carolina, Charleston, Columbia, Greenville, those big red blotches. This is not a crisis only on the southern border. This is a crisis right here in South Carolina. And that is a crisis that we're committed to covering, but not only this sound and fury from the left and the right, but we are going to cover it the way it should be covered, which is by bringing you information that you're not going to get from any other media outlet in South Carolina. Perspective. That's what we're about here. And also, I want to point out, as we dive back into this issue over the coming days, weeks, and months, I want to remind everybody watching this that FITSNews, we have views on this, strong views. Obviously, I've articulated some on this show. But we exist to host a conversation. And the open microphone, we talk about it on the abortion issue. We talk about it on justice reform. But that microphone is always on because our job is to host the conversation. So if you've been to the border, if you've got perspectives on it, share them with us. We'll publish them, even if they run counter to what we're saying. Because again, our job is to host a conversation. And one last point before we go. In the past, I have looked at politicians who have gone down to the border as pulling political stunts. That perspective has absolutely changed. I would encourage every elected official in this state to visit the U.S.-Mexican border, to talk to some of the same folks that we spoke with. Because again, you're not hearing the truth on those cable TV shows, and you're not hearing the truth from the mainstream press. You got to go down. You got to see it for yourself. And if you're a leader, not to do so, I would argue, is negligent. So you will never hear this news outlet criticize a politician for visiting the border. You should absolutely go visit the border. Anyway, this has been a very different week in review for us, folks. And you'll probably see some of this sprinkled in future episodes, but it is incredibly important because I'm telling you, based on what we have seen, nothing less than the future of this country is at stake. And if we don't figure out a way, again, to be a nation of tall fences and wide gates, we're not going to have a nation for much longer.